Between 82 and 88, Gary Ridgway, known as America's most prolific serial killer, murdered 71 women. He was convicted for 49 of those crimes, but admitted that the number could have been closer to 90, as he later reported that he killed so many he lost count. Gary Leen Ridgway was born February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. His mother has been described as domineering, and his father was often heard complaining about sex workers. Ridgway, having a complicated home life, had a bedwetting problem until he was 13, and his mother would wash his genitals after every episode. He would later tell defense psychologists that, as an adolescent, he nurtured conflicting feelings about his mother and fantasized about killing her. When he was 16, Ridgway stabbed a 6-year-old whom thankfully survived the attack. He led them through the woods and then stabbed him, through his ribs and then into his liver. Ridgway's IQ was recorded as being in the low 80s. He joined the U.S. Navy and was sent to Vietnam, where he saw combat serving on board of a supply ship. During this time, and even though married, he had frequent sexual intercourse with sex workers without protection. According to women in his life, Ridgway had an insatiable sexual appetite. Ridgway himself admitted to having a fixation with sexual workers, with whom he had a love-hate relationship despite his staunch religious beliefs. Most of Ridgway's victims were sex workers or underage runaways whom he picked up at truck stops and dive bars along Highway 99. He would rape and strangle them, sometimes by hand and others using ligatures, before dumping their bodies in wooden areas and some around the Green River. He often purposefully contaminated the crime scenes with litter, gum, and cigarette butts belonging to others as an attempt to throw the authorities off. Occasionally, he would dump the body in one place, leave it for a time, and then transport it to another location to create a false trail. At least 2 victims were transported as far away as Portland. The bodies were often left in clusters, sometimes posed, usually nude. At times, he would return to visit his victims' bodies and have sexual intercourse with them. Ridgway later explained that he did not find necrophilia more sexually satisfying, but having sex with the deceased reduced his need to obtain a living victim, and thus limited his exposure to being caught. Because most of the bodies were not discovered until only the skeletons remained, some of the victims are not yet identified. Ridgway began each murder by picking up a woman, usually a sex worker. He sometimes showed the victim a picture of his son in a shameless attempt to trick her into trusting him. After raping her, Ridgway strangled her from behind, initially with his hands, but after many victims inflicted wounds and bruises on his arms whilst trying to defend themselves, he began using ligatures. He murdered most victims in his home, his truck, or a secluded area. When the bodies started appearing, the King County Sheriff's Office started up the Green River Task Force, hoping to discover the person responsible for the crimes. 2 members of the task force were Robert Keppel and Dave Reinhardt, who periodically interviewed psychologists and criminologists, hoping to gain an insight into the motives behind the killer's murders. Eventually, in 1984, their interviews led them to famed serial killer Ted Bundy, who had been imprisoned for the past 6 years for murder, rape, burglary, and necrophilia, and was, at the time, awaiting his electrocution, which would come 3 years later. Having deplorable but valuable first-hand experience with the same kind of killings that had been happening in the Green River area, Bundy proved to be an asset on the case. He became a regular interviewee of Keppel and Reinhardt and offered his opinion on the mindset of the killer as well as his motivations and behavior. During one interview session, Bundy suggested that the killer was most likely revisiting the dump sites to engage in sexual intercourse with the bodies. He advised the investigators that, in case they find a fresh grave, stake it out and wait for the killer to return. Bundy's theories turned out to be true, and the police were able to use them to collect samples and provide evidence for an arrest warrant. However, it took police until 2001 to finally arrest Ridgway. 20 years after committing his crimes, Gary Ridgway was arrested on suspicions of murdering 4 women, and his DNA was, later, conclusively linked to them. Forensic testing later revealed that the same spray paint Ridgway used at work during his crime spree was present at other crime scenes and added those murders to the list of charges. Ridgway allowed the victim to escape, and she bravely contacted police about the assault, managing to recognize him out of a police lineup. Although he was honest about assaulting her, he claimed she bit him, and therefore he acted on self-defense. The victim, as she told detectives what happened, mentioned he did accuse her of biting him, but that she had not. On June 14, 2003, Gary Ridgway and the task force embarked on their first field trip to find the undiscovered remains of victims on their list as part of his agreement to avoid the death penalty. Over the first 3 days, Ridgway provides 12 sites where he had placed the bodies, and the dig team excavates each location. They find nothing. During incarceration, Gary Ridgway developed a good Gary and a bad Gary, one who committed the crimes and the one who was trying to redeem himself. Although the task force kept spending numerous resources on his tips, they were leading nowhere and wearing out the investigators. According to Ridgway, his son, Matthew, was once in the car as he preyed on another victim and gave her a ride as a pretend Good Samaritan, innocently carrying a child.